When it comes to sort of like the ultimate principles, it's really, really tricky because, to Amy's point, the commodification of women and their bodies is a risk. But on the other hand, children are an absolute blessing. The law says that. Unwanted pregnancies in Canada, you cannot be compensated for and remedy for the rearing of a child. You can't say, well, I don't want this, I don't like this. The court says, too bad, so sad, children are awesome. So even if it's unwanted, you can seek remedy and redress for the financial consequences, the pain, suffering, harm of a pregnancy itself, but not for the existence and the raising of a child.
My friends, let us consider that acuity is the refined clarity of thought and perception which enables one to discern subtle truths.
Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of the Acuity Podcast, Politics and Culture. I'm the host, CEO, and Chief Litigator of Acuity Medical Law, Dr. Lavranos, and with me is my charming, lovely, wonderful communications manager and co-host, Amy Hamm, and we are delighted this week to bring you a very special guest, Adam, and I'm going to give it away to Amy to introduce him.
Yeah, thank you. We're so pleased today to be joined by Adam Zivo. Adam is one of my National Post colleagues. I think that I can speak for Canadians when I say that he's one of Canada's favorite columnists. Adam often critically covers harm reduction and the opioid overdose crisis. In addition to global politics, he's joining us today from Ukraine, where his fiancée lives. So today is going to be a little bit of a different format on the podcast. We're going to have a good old-fashioned debate. The topic is surrogacy. Paid surrogacy is illegal in Canada under the Assisted Human Reproduction Act, but that doesn't mean that it's not an industry here. There are an estimated 400 to 500 babies born via surrogacy in Canada every year. The number is probably a lot bigger, but we don't know about these cases. And an AI search told me that there are currently upwards of 18 surrogacy agencies in this country. So the three of us hold very different views about surrogacy, and I think that some of our views are deeply personal. So that said, why don't we dive right in? We're going to do kind of a round table, and each of us will spend a few minutes laying out our arguments without interruption before we hold sort of a back and forth debate afterwards. So let's jump in. Does someone want to volunteer to be the first person to lay out their argument?
I think I'll wait for you guys to lay out your arguments because on my end, I see this as more of a lack of compelling arguments for banning surrogacy.
Okay.
Okay. Interesting. Okay.
All right.
Shots fired.
Okay. Amy, you go ahead. You start. Frame the conversation from your point of view.
Okay. I will. And that might be a good idea. I think that I might have the most controversial take on this issue. And, one that sort of aligns in general with second wave or radical feminists, even though I don't consider myself to be a part of those groups necessarily. So, let me start. So I oppose surrogacy in nearly all cases. I believe that there may exist circumstances in which a woman chooses to be a surrogate for purely altruistic reasons, say like a sister or a family member that's wanting to help their loved one to have a family. However, I think that this type of circumstance is an extreme exception, and that the moral and ethical challenge of determining what constitutes a truly altruistic surrogacy situation is so overwhelming and nuanced that I don't think the practice can or should be justified at all. As a caveat, I understand that the position that I'm taking will leave some persons who desperately want to have children without them. And I understand how devastating that could be. I would be devastated to not have my own children. I have 2 sons. They mean everything to me. However, I also don't believe that it is a right to be able to have children. I think that it is a privilege. And sadly, I think that there are people in this world who have that privilege when they don't even deserve it. And then there are people in this world who will not have that privilege despite being very deserving of having such an incredible and sort of life-altering experience. So now I'll kind of lay out what the main issues are that I have with surrogacy. Chiefly, I sort of see it as akin to prostitution, which I also oppose, in the way that it uses a woman's body in a really profound and sometimes harmful manner. I believe that it is morally wrong to pay a woman to be a surrogate, as this will attract women who are desperate for their own survival, so desperate that they're willing to do things with their bodies that fundamentally can cause them harm physically or emotionally. I think that vulnerable, especially financially vulnerable women are, of course, drawn to surrogacy. And I question whether or not women in these circumstances have the capacity to consent to the process. And then I would note that even in countries like Canada, where it is technically illegal to pay for a surrogate, that still happens. It's happening even in our own industry and even with the legislation that tries to stop this from happening. And I've heard firsthand accounts of this happening. I know that it does. And, you know, I believe it's morally wrong to have a contract wherein a woman gives birth to a child, and then if she changes her mind, even at the very last moment, she can't refuse to hand the child over to the person who paid or used her as a surrogate. Even if the woman used a donor egg, I still believe that carrying and growing an infant in your body for 40 weeks makes you a mother. And I think that's a really important term and concept, is mother. I think surrogacy sort of erases the idea of the mother existing at all. And I believe, again, like with prostitution, this is an industry that can be and is being abused, which I can sort of detail more when we get into the discussion. But I see surrogacy as basically a different form of human trafficking. Humans are being bought and sold ultimately. And it's certainly not as sinister in hopefully the vast majority of cases as trafficking is for the purposes of prostitution. But ultimately, I can't really differentiate between these two when I sort of think about it on a moral and ethical level. So, and then another thing is I also believe infants should stay with their mothers whenever possible. I think it's in their best interest to not be removed and handed over to what is essentially a stranger. And yes, this does happen with adoption, but I also find that really sad. And I think it's morally wrong to intentionally create a situation where an infant is removed from its mother. So I can acknowledge that surrogacy has benefits for some people and for some families, but I think that overall surrogacy is a net detriment to humanity. That's how I would lay out my argument.
Sure.
Yeah, Adam, if you want to go instead of me first, I have no problem, and then I can sort of like present my perspective at the end.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll respond to Amy's stance, and I want to say that I sympathize, first of all, with many of the arguments that you do bring up. I do think that surrogacy is a form of labor and that it is comparable to prostitution in this sense. But I am a classical liberal, and I think that people have a right to do what they want with their bodies. And I think that you may have a right to believe that surrogacy or prostitution is morally wrong, but you do not have a right to tell someone whether or not they can use their body in that way, because it is their body and they have ultimate command over it. And if they choose to engage in prostitution, if they choose to engage in surrogacy, that is ultimately their choice. Now, I agree with you that just like with prostitution, the world of surrogacy is often murky and can create situations where vulnerable women are exploited. And this is why I believe that surrogacy needs to be heavily regulated. And that the current situation that we have in Canada, where we have a gray market, where commercial surrogacy is technically forbidden, but there are many loopholes that allow it to functionally exist, is not ideal. And I would advocate for legalizing commercial surrogacy so we can more effectively regulate it to ensure that vulnerable women are not trapped in legally gray situations. And I think that regulation would also answer some of the trickier questions associated with surrogacy. So, for example, you mentioned what happens when a surrogate mother doesn't want to give up their child. And I would agree with you that there is a degree of parenthood that comes with being the gestational parent here. But I think that in this situation, there should be a blended parenthood where the biological mother, as in the genetic mother, as well as the genetic father, also have parental rights here, in which case you have a strange situation where you have three parents of one child. But I think that that's something that is acceptable and would be would be a reasonable compromise, but you need to have regulation to create these kinds of situations. When it comes to the rights of children, so I find that the way this is often framed is people will imagine two different scenarios. They'll say, okay, well, we have the child without their birth mother, and then, or sorry, their gestational mother, and then we have the child with a traditional, usually heterosexual family. But this is not the choice that these children have. The choice is between them being born into an imperfect family or not existing at all, right? Like these children are not souls that are flying in the universe and waiting to like enter either a perfect family or an imperfect one. They either exist or in an imperfect way or they don't exist at all. And I think that for if you were to talk to an adult who was given life through surrogacy and say, would you have preferred to have just not existed at all? I think most of them would have said, I'm glad I was born, even if my family is not exactly what everyone else's family looks like. Um, I do think that surrogacy is comparable to adoption. And people will say, oh, they disagree with this idea that children can be bought and sold. But children are already bought and sold in an altruistic way, in that we have for profit adoption industries. I mean, the United States is based on a system of for profit adoption, right? And that system allows children to be placed more effectively with parents who love them, right? And so I think that if you can accept this idea that for profit adoption exists and that it has good outcomes, I don't see how people can simultaneously object to for profit surrogacy or even altruistic surrogacy. And I would like to understand why there are double standards there. When it comes to every parent deserving to have a mother and father, we already have significant data showing that the children of same sex parents, for example, often have really great outcomes. And that you can, like, children of same sex parents they often have better outcomes than like children of heterosexuals, because they're being born into families that very clearly want them, right? They're being born into usually affluent families that are not having them by mistake. We're not talking about teenagers who are accidentally having a kid. These are people who are going through the entire process, who are paying, anywhere between $50,000 to $200,000, which is a lot of money, right? So they have the means, and being born into a family that has material wealth is associated with better outcomes. Then on top of that, if we're going to say that people shouldn't have kids because the kids might not have the optimal conditions to be raised, I mean, do we extend that logic to other factors involved, like other factors too? Do we say, for example, that alcoholics shouldn't have children because there is a genetic predisposition to alcoholism? Should we pressure teenage mothers to abort their children? Should we sterilize the poor, if you want to use a more extreme example of that principle? I think that it is better for us to bring more children into this world, even if their circumstances aren't fully ideal. Like I personally, I'm a gay man. I would love to have a family. I understand it would be better if my partner was a woman, if my child could have a mother, but that's not the world that we're in. But I think that's better than these children not existing at all. And, that's especially true in a political and cultural context where we are looking at a collapse in fertility, right? So I would rather have surrogate babies raised by affluent people who are from, for example, Canada, than to deal with population collapse or bringing in people from foreign countries that may not align with our values.
I find it super compelling, Adam. I will tell you that where I stand, I think all arguments can be framed in deontological or principle approach versus something consequential. And I think that you have done a really good job on both sides of addressing a lot of the deontological arguments and sort of how they fall through. I think that one of the things that you raised as a classical liberal is the right to the marketplace for the person's own body. I think that the only risk that we run there is that there are limits of what we should, as a society, accept within even a free market. What those limits are kind of gray and they're shady. But if I said that I want to replace my kidneys every 15 to 20 years so I can get a new set, should we allow people to commodify the selling of their organs? If I said that, I hurt my leg really badly and I want to replace my leg with somebody else's that's younger and healthier, should I have the opportunity to do that? So there's, I think, a natural limit that we can sort of like feel there should be placed on even something as a free market. So to your point about prostitution, certainly there's the promotion of the idea that the person should have the autonomy to do what they want. A lot of sex that's had today is a form of prostitution, whether explicit or implicit. So it's not like this doesn't happen already very regularly. But that being said, do we want a society in which such ideas and such constructs are embraced and empowered? Do we want red light districts? Do we want sort of seedy neighborhoods? Do we want to encourage or empower that option in society? And so I think that that's where the sort of like free market idea runs up against some friction. Although to your point, I do see how it does apply here, and I still think it's compelling in this instance. When it comes to sort of like the ultimate principles, it's really, really tricky because to Amy's point, the commodification of women and their bodies is a risk. But on the other hand, children are an absolute blessing. The law says that. Unwanted pregnancies in Canada, you cannot be compensated for and remedy for the rearing of a child. You can't say, well, I don't want this, I don't like this. The court says, too bad, so sad, children are awesome. So even if it's unwanted, you can seek remedy and redress for the financial consequences, the pain, suffering, harm of a pregnancy itself, but not for the existence and the raising of a child. And so from a legal point of view, we already acknowledge that. And then obviously from a societal point of view, children should be embraced and people should be encouraged to have children. I think part of my problem is when we look at the biggest scale issues here, encouraging people to be surrogate as opposed to dealing with the unfortunate circumstances of adoption, to me, is a problem. So from a market point of view, I don't know what the answer would be to incentivize people to preferentially seek something in the range of adoption, which I think is a super beautiful thing, as opposed to seeking surrogacy. On the flip side, a lot that might encourage people giving up their children for adoption, right? And then you might have an increase in the amount of children who are abandoned. So I'm like, it's a tricky kind of like forces on how to balance. So that's why, like, on this topic, I'm very, very neutral. I have gay family members who have gone through surrogacy and have children. Some of my closest friends and colleagues have gone through the same process. They are absolutely wonderful families. It's worthwhile touching on the idea that, okay, of course, a lot of surrogate parents happen to be homosexual, and there is this evidence out there. It's pretty weak. It's pretty old, suggesting that homosexual parents are more likely to abuse their children than heterosexual parents are. The evidence to that end is very weak. I've heard that argument before. I'm only addressing it here. The evidence is particularly weak. It's particularly old, and it doesn't take into consideration many other confounding factors, like those predominantly tend to be from broken homes, from parents who have had sexual assault experiences in their lives, who have substance abuse problems, and so on and so on. So it's just very murky territory to kind of use that as an argument. So I remain like pretty neutral on the fact. I think your point about regulation is a really good one because you can address a lot of problems associated with surrogacy through appropriate regulation, follow-up, and so on.
If I could just go into the idea of regulation a bit more, and again, making a comparison to prostitution. So Canada uses what's called the Nordic model of prostitution, where it is illegal to purchase sex, but it's not illegal to be a prostitute or to sell sex. So you're criminalized on the buying end, but not on the selling end. And I think we have the data to show that this is the version, because we kind of know prostitution will exist no matter what we try to do to stop it. It's just something that will always be around. And I think surrogacy might be similar. And so we know that like this is the way to make it the least harmful to women, to have the best outcome for women. So I think, maybe it's a similar issue with surrogacy where it's illegal to pay for it in Canada, but there's still a black market happening. It's still going on. So I'm not entirely saying like we shouldn't even allow it. Maybe what we have is sort of the best of the worst situation right now in terms of outlawing it being paid. But we do know that it is still an industry. And, I would bring up as an example, like even the CBC, which is, as far as maybe all of us here are concerned, does a lot of left-wing propaganda. Back in 2020, they did an investigative journalism piece. They ran an expose about surrogacy. They found surrogate mothers that were, they're still getting paid under the table for you're allowed to reimburse the surrogate mother for costs, and they're claiming like lottery tickets, $700 a month on groceries just for themselves. One woman who felt that the surrogate parents weren't they were questioning her bills too much, threatened to abort the baby halfway through the pregnancy. Like, it's not functioning properly, and you can tell that the women who are doing it are not doing it for altruistic reasons. So I guess I would be willing to concede that there is perhaps a way that the legislation should exist that would maximally protect women, but still allow for some sort of industry. But I still would fundamentally and morally and ethically disagree with it existing at all.
So what I would argue is that there are vulnerable women, or let's put it this way, there are women who do not have significant financial means who are going to find surrogacy to be who are going to prefer surrogacy as a form of labor as opposed to other work, right? So if you have a poor woman who decides to engage in surrogacy, she's making a choice here, right? She finds this form of labor more dignified and more comfortable than, let's say, working as a telemarketer or, breaking her body in an Amazon warehouse, or all of the indignities associated with a gig economy. And when we force women like this to do this kind of work under the table, we are eroding their negotiating power, and we're making this transaction more complicated for them unnecessarily. So when I think of, for example, a woman who is engaging in quasi-legal surrogacy and is forced to compensate herself through lottery tickets, I mean, I think that's a really bad situation for everyone, right? And it's especially bad for this woman who is working as a surrogate. And I would much rather have a situation where she is able to just simply be paid in actual money according to the market value of her work, and that she doesn't have to go through all of these hoops, and where, because what she's doing is legal, she can seek recourse if she is in any way threatened or exploited by the family that has hired her as a surrogate.
So maybe I can ask like each of you a couple of questions and go down that route, because I think you're making some really good points, Adam, and you too, Amy. So, Amy, do you think that the principle of the commodification of women, let's say within a regulatory framework, do you think that risk as a virtue in society supersedes the total benefit of people becoming parents?
I still believe that it is a net detriment to society to have surrogacy, and I believe the same thing about prostitution, but I sort of begrudgingly am aware that they will exist regardless of how I feel about it or how many people can agree to whether it's a net good or a net bad. So I think we are left having to, in the best way we can, regulate this economy that exists. Even though it's an ethically and morally fraught economy, it exists. So what are we going to do about it? But I think, what I have a problem with is when people try to sort of whitewash it and suggest that, oh, but look at all of the good that it brings into the world. And it is a really compelling emotional argument, like including from you, Adam, to say like, these are families, they really want the babies. They're financially stable. And I know, like, even I know you're a friend of mine. I think you would make an amazing parent and family. But I can't walk away from the fact that I think the harms to women are just so immense, and I can't get around it. I take absolutist positions on a lot of issues, and maybe that's contrary to my own sort of classical liberal values, which is about individualism, but it's like I take absolutist positions on like free speech, and even on issues like male daycare workers, things like that, the death penalty, where I'm like, no, there's a risk here of something morally wrong, and I'm willing to take a really extreme absolutist position to prevent something that I think is really bad, and that's how I feel about surrogacy.
I want to say
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Respond.
Amy, I agree with you that I think that the dynamics of surrogacy are sometimes whitewashed by surrogacy supporters, and that we have to be frank about the fact that it can, and sometimes often is, an exploitative industry. And there was a particularly nauseating case that was reported upon earlier this year from the United States where some Chinese multimillionaire paid 10, 11, 12 surrogates.
I think
13.
13.
Yeah. To have babies within the span of just what, 2-3 years. And then
Yeah.
deceive all of these surrogates and then like reared these children in a mansion in some kind of cult-like environment. And then when the surrogates began asking questions, they were subjected to legal harassment. And this is, of course, a very extreme example. And that doesn't reflect all surrogacy much in the same way how there are extreme examples of international adoption that are horrifying, that don't delegitimize international adoption. But we have to be frank about the fact that, yeah, some women are they are harmed by this, and especially if they are low income and they're dealing with high income couples. But this is where I think where you and I differ here is that you want to take this economy and keep it illegal. Where I think that just it is a better option for us to regulate it, very carefully regulate it, but to regulate it.
So can I ask Adam, with respect to economy markets, do you see an issue with the availability of a market being created outside of a black market for surrogacy? So, for example, if we were to contrast it to, let's just say that there was a industrial acceptance of maid, such that I could open up a maid clinic here. People could pay me $500. I kill them, I dispose of their bodies, and they just come in, and it's a small margin of profit, and I offered that. Or if I was to harm reduction opiates. It's my body. I'm going to choose to destroy it with opiates and make that widely available. Do you think that there are some sort of systemic issues associated with a market that allows or promotes surrogacy compared to maintaining it as a sort of a shadow market that has to be sort of like parallel to a functioning full economy?
Well, so the examples that you cited have negative externalities. For example, I don't think that you have a right just to consume as many drugs as you want because at that point, it's not just your body. Because when you become a drug addict, you become incredibly violent and basically schizophrenic, and you become a burden on everyone around you. So it is no longer just about you. But I think that when it comes to surrogacy, I don't think that the act of childbirth in itself is in any way shameful or harmful. I mean, obviously, it can be in that there can be complications associated with pregnancy, but I don't view these health risks as being more substantial than, let's say, higher risk forms of labor, like being an oil rig worker, right? And we accept that as a form of labor. So I would say that because the negative externalities are minimal, I'm okay with there being a market. And some people might be uncomfortable with the idea of there being more surrogates than fewer surrogates, right? The idea that if you create a market, that then people enter this market and they're engaging in surrogacy when they otherwise wouldn't. But these new players who enter the market are making a choice, right? And if the demand for surrogacy in a legal market drives the compensation rates up higher, then that incentivizes women to participate in this market because now they find it to be a preferable option than, let's say, being demeaned as a minimum wage worker at McDonald's, or dealing with the instability of the gig economy, right? Like, I think that as much as we want to portray these women as being passive victims, and some of them are, and once again, I think regulation can help with that. Many of them are, once again, willingly choosing this form of labor because it better suits their life than other options.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to say a couple of things. So, number one, about going back to the Nordic model for prostitution, and what the data shows is that when you legalize a market, the demand is a lot bigger because it's legal. And so the idea that, now all these women that would have otherwise been surrogates but are not because of market forces, that's not actually the case with prostitution. What happens is trafficking. Because it's legal, it causes criminal trafficking. And so the best way to protect women in the case of prostitution is by making it illegal to buy sex. And I believe the same thing is true. The best way to protect women and babies in surrogacy is by making it illegal to pay surrogates and to pay for babies. And then I guess the other thing I would say, sort of putting on a feminist hat about, the idea like when you're when you are using drugs to the detriment of society around you. I think that we're ignoring the fact that a lot of the women who are surrogates, and also prostitution, but I'll put that aside for a moment. It's like these are a lot of the times are traumatized, abused, really vulnerable women that wouldn't be doing this otherwise. And the impact, like speaking as a mother who's given birth twice, and the idea of like giving away the infant that you birth is so psychologically traumatizing for a lot of women. And I know firsthand, like I know a gay couple that illegally paid for a surrogate in Canada. They gave this person money that they used outside of the country. And this mother, they sort of did all of it under the table. She started begging them to have the baby back, asking like, can you rewrite your will, give me the baby back if you both die, this sort of thing. Like, I think there are huge psychological and probably societal harms that it's really obvious when you see homeless drug addicts on the street. I think the same types of harms are happening to women, but we're not even paying attention to it, and we're not even recognizing it.
So, Amy, let me ask you down that in that spirit, if this became more acceptable, if this became above board, and people started to know and recognize those features, either to address it and mitigate it ahead of time, or that only those who have already participated in it and who know that go in there and they're sort of like much more aware practitioners, right? I mean, like to Adam's point, it's not to suggest that oil rig workers don't know that it's particularly dangerous, or that coal mine workers don't know that it's particularly dangerous. And so there are certain risks that you are willing to accept in the process of a occupation that you have accepted. So do you think that there is sufficient mitigation that will allow people to better tolerate some of those risks? Because I mean, like, Adam is not going to deny those risks. Like, obviously, there's a profound risk to the mom being separated from a child that, like she just gestated. So do you think that being forewarned is sufficiently forearmed to be able to mitigate, I'm not going to say avoid, those risks?
I'm not sure. And I think I'm not sure that it's a comparable comparison between hard labor, dangerous work that men do versus these things. Like, I think sex, giving birth are these just profoundly human experiences. And I'm not sure we can compare them to other like dangerous work that men typically do. I think, like you talked about earlier, trying to draw a line somewhere. It's like it's a nuanced position, and I think like ethically, morally, there's a difference between these things that we do as human beings that are such like basic functions of our bodies, and it's such an invasive thing to have happen to your body. And I just don't really think it's a fair comparison between doing danger work, getting danger pay, versus doing something that involves like a cascade of hormones, your whole psychology. I just don't think those two things are in the same category.
Yeah. Adam, can I ask you a hypothetical? It's a really
Sure.
big hypothetical here. Okay. So you go to a business event or a cocktail party or something along those lines, and you are passing out business cards, you're receiving a bunch of business cards, and at the end of the night, you're at home and you're flipping through the new Rolodex of cards that you don't remember everybody. One of them says prostitute, outlines a price model, says, I've been doing this for 4 years. I have a 90% approval rating on Google. Feel free to come check me out. The second one says, I operate a maid clinic. People come in here. It's extremely effective, ease your suffering, very low prices. Come on in. And the third one says, surrogate. I've had 12 babies, only one really bad negative outcome. So my success rate is 92%, just about. For all your surrogacy needs, I'm booking 1 year out after I finish delivering this one. Do you feel like those instinctively, sort of like in your gut, any of those strike you as that's a little strange or that's a little unsettling?
Only the second one, to be honest. Only the maid one.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
For context, before I became an evil conservative columnist, I was a gay activist. And so I spent my 20s surrounded by sex workers and porn stars and models. And, they were fine. They had sex with their clients and they made their money. And we would sometimes see each other in the club or over coffee, and that was okay. And
Okay,
sometimes
sure.
we were shamed for their labor, but I didn't see why that was a big problem, right? I mean, I didn't see and still don't see their sex work as any more demeaning than, working in retail, right? I mean, for the most part, they had control over their interactions in the same way that you don't when you have a customer shouting at you when you work at a cafe, for example. Um, when it comes to maid, I have reservations about that only because of the way that the maid system is being implemented in Canada. And I think that there are insufficient guardrails in place. So I do worry whether some people who provide maid are exploiting people who do not cannot consent to dying, right? And for surrogacy, I mean, my evaluation of them would be based on, well, do they seem like they're in control of the system? Do they seem like they're in control of their bodies? Right. In the same way that I would talk to any other kind of like freelancer, right? Uh, so I would view from that lens. Now, I do want to say that I recognize and appreciate Amy's objections and her acknowledgement of the fact that many potential surrogate mothers are unstable, vulnerable, young. And this is where I think regulation and a licensing system could be effective, right? And I think that sometimes there are conversations about the need to vet surrogate parents, right? Because right now, you can be a surrogate and no one's going to ask whether or not you're bringing a child into a loving family versus adoption. If you adopt a child, you have to go through a whole system. They want to make sure that the child is going to a family that can probably take care of it. If you're a surrogate, none of that applies. And in the conversation around surrogacy, people say, well, we should fix that. And I agree with that. But I think conversely, I think that if you want to provide surrogacy services, that there should be a licensing body. You should go through some kind of training course. Presumably, it would be paid for by potential surrogates, by potential customers. I mean, they're paying tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars already, so it's not that much for them to pay for some level of education and mental health support. And I think that women who are obviously mentally unstable or obviously vulnerable should be filtered out of the system and not be allowed to participate in a legal surrogacy market, and that the gatekeepers for who participates in this market, should include, for example, therapists or psychologists to ensure that anyone who wants to be a surrogate is sufficiently prepared and stable enough.
I think that licensing idea does a lot to mitigate some of the risks and consequences that I think of. So, Amy, let me ask you: do you think that there are people who would not be cajoled, coerced, compelled to do this, who would ultimately find a net benefit in this that's voluntary? And I'm going to bring you an example. I have a very close loved one who, a lot of the time, is unwell, has had 3 children. Whenever they are pregnant, they are very well. And so the capacity for them to continue to be pregnant is actually extremely beneficial to them. They also happen to be of a more affluent background than not. They also tend to be really responsible with their bodies. Like they're not going to pollute and do crack and, toxins to a developing baby. If such a person, in my instance, they would never give up their baby. But if such a person was like, hey, you know what? I love Adam and there are other people like Adam out there and I want to be able to help them. Is there a world in which you could see somebody who could voluntarily, free of coercion, go through a process like that?
I do ultimately think that there are, and I think I laid it out at the beginning. I think there are really extreme outliers where it is 100% altruistic. I don't see any ethical issues. I do think those situations exist. And I just think that if you're looking at things on a scale, that I would be in favor of, if I could ban it outright, I would, because I think the net harms are so much greater. But definitely, I recognize there are women, I think, who want to do it altruistically. And it's the same. I keep going back to prostitution, but I do genuinely believe that there is a really tiny, tiny minority of women who actually want to do that work and they give consent to do it. But, and then I think that's another thing where maybe the male brain doesn't quite understand the harms of doing these things, because again, for sex and for males, men and women come at sex at such a different perspective and it affects us psychologically very differently. And I don't think that men necessarily understand the psychological and physical impact of like doing prostitution or sex work on the female psyche or body. And I feel the same about surrogacy. And I guess what I would also say is, when I was sort of looking at this episode, I wanted to look at what are the most recent things that people have written about surrogacy. And there's this book called Broken Bonds, Surrogate Moms Speak Out. And so this publisher put together a group of essays by surrogate mothers who, most of these essays, these were women who genuinely believed that they were going into surrogacy for purely altruistic reasons. And then after they had their babies, they felt that they had been deceived, neglected, abused, harassed, and then some of them were left dealing with like legal repercussions, trying to, you know, deal with financial and legal issues with the clinics, with lawyers, and with the parents. And this includes essays written from women in Canada. So I just think it's such an ethically fraught industry, that I just really, I know, and I feel bad saying it because I know that there are a lot of people out there whose families are complete through surrogacy, but I can't look away from stories. Like, I think what you guys were talking about earlier was what has sort of been dubbed the Los Angeles baby factory investigation, where, you know, it's like this rich couple and they have like 21 surrogate babies. And 2 of those surrogate mothers right now are fighting in the court system to regain, or, well, not to regain, but to gain custody of the babies that they gave birth to this very bizarre, weird, rich couple that, like, why do they have all of these babies? Are they trafficking them? It's still in the court, so we don't exactly know what the hell is going on. And I just think, you know, ultimately, this is a net harm to the babies that are born and to women in our society. And I think that we should do the most that we can, like we do with the Nordic model of prostitution, I would never want to punish a woman who tried to do it altruistically of her own accord. I think that would be similar to the Nordic model of prostitution, where you say it's not illegal to sell sex. And so we would say it's not illegal to sort of on this underground market become a surrogate for altruistic reasons. But it is illegal in every way and form to use a surrogate, whether or not you're outright paying her or just reimbursing her expenses. I think that when you have the market like Canada does, even with our current legal regulations, that it encourages more harms to occur, and that it creates a market that invites women to be exploited in that marketplace. I don't want that market to exist at all.
I really wish that we could A/B test this somehow, right? Like, wouldn't it be great if, like, for example, Nova Scotia piloted a program licensing surrogates? You have to have been a Nova Scotia citizen, a citizen of Canada, a resident of Nova Scotia for 2 years, go through this process, see how it happens, see what the consequences are. Because, I mean, like, we're sitting here and Adam makes a very compelling case at an individual level. And then, you know, Amy, you're arguing from a very, very macro level, like across a society, the total net is going to be net harm. So it's like super interesting. There's no real way to know, right? Like, this is just so abstract. It's so abstract. Adam, please go ahead. I interrupted you.
Yeah, I mean, so Amy, you cited those cases of surrogate mothers who felt like they had been deceived and found themselves in troubling situations. I think we can make a comparison here to adoption, right? Because, or any kind of issues where, any kind of complicated issue concerning child custody. There were women who give up their children for adoption who later regret it and try to re-win custody of their child, or who lose custody because they are incapable of being parents and then find themselves in a difficult limbo. And those situations are never easy to navigate, and they're painful for everyone involved, but they don't delegitimize the adoption system as a whole. We recognize that when we are dealing with the custody of children, that things can get very sticky and they can get very painful, but it is necessary for us to trudge through these moral quagmires. And I view surrogacy in the same way, where there are really ugly cases where people are harmed, and not just surrogate parents too. I mean, sorry, not just surrogates too, but also, like, you know, the genetic parents as well. But I think that we just have to trudge through that and over time incrementally build a regulatory system that minimizes harm.
Yeah, yeah. It's compelling. The difference is, um, to me anyway, and I remain really really neutral on this. The difference to me is that, um, I imagine that the majority of adoption cases, like what they used to say about, abortion, should be safe, legal, and rare. And when we hope that the process of a child being adopted is something that nobody is opting for, it is a certain consequence of existence. These things will happen. And on the flip side, creating a system that permits, surrogacy kind of opens a door. But I appreciate what you're saying, Adam, that there's lots of opportunity for how to sort of minimize that so that it's not a floodgate of all kinds of negative consequences, to Amy's point of view, right? Like, so I kind of sit there because it's really tricky. To Amy's original point, having kids is like the greatest thing ever in my life. Like, people always ask me what I like most about my life, what avenue of work and my profession and so on, and I always tell them I love the most when I get to sit and see my girls playing with each other, playing with their mom, learning, reading things that I never knew. So of course, I would love that for everyone, and I would love that for society. I often make the, parable that if I'm in Greece or if I'm traveling in Europe or in the Middle East, there's a huge welcoming environment for children. It's very, very much a safe and empowering place for children. Everyone stops and plays with your child, talks to you about your child, and so on. And then you come here and you're back in Canada, and everything is child-free environments, child-free zones, child-free this. You go to the grocery store, maybe an old lady just kind of sheepishly waves. I'm like, you can come and talk to her. You can normalize that children exist in society. So the idea of promoting, a child-friendly world is very good, and this is one process by which we can do that. Let alone the consequence, as Adam had mentioned earlier, about problems with, fertility rates and, birth rates in the West. So I mean, like, I don't know. It's very tricky, very tricky.
I just want to mention something here. So earlier we talked about the choice between having a child through surrogacy versus adoption. And I think that if we were looking at this from a purely moral perspective, clearly adoption would be the better option at a societal level. And that would apply for all parents too, right? Like if there was a heterosexual family that could choose to have a third biological child, you could say, well, actually it's your moral imperative to adopt a child. But I think we all understand that there is a selfish but very understandable desire to have a child who is biologically related to you. That is just something that is hardwired within us to want. Um, and then on top of that, oftentimes children who are in the foster care system, or even if they're still infants, when you adopt them, they often come with a lot of issues. I was recently with a colleague who has an adopted son who she loves, and she gave him the best childhood he could possibly imagine, but he is a drug addict who held her hostage at knife point, right? And I think people who adopt, they're heroes, and I respect them, but there is a lot of risk involved. And I think that it is understandable and it's okay if people don't want to take that risk on for their own lives. Kudos to anyone who adopts. They're all great. We should support adoption, but it is understandable if you don't want to adopt. So I think that's surrogacy is a reasonable alternative. And for example, on my end, like I would love to have kids. I would, if I couldn't get a child through surrogacy, I would probably adopt, but I would also might think twice about that. And so once again, it's a choice between there not being a child or there being a child.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get
You know
that.
what I
And
would
like,
say?
I'm pro adoption, and my wife is
Yeah.
very, very apprehensive about it. So I understand very much that that's like a natural part of us. Go ahead, Amy.
So it's interesting. I agree with what you just said, Adam. I guess the only wrench that I would throw in the works is knowing, and you probably are familiar with Gabor Mate as well. He's a physician who is in BC. He does a lot of the sort of harm reduction and addictions medicine. I think his most famous book was In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And he opens that book. He's talking about, he was actually, like his mother survived the Holocaust. He was like an infant, and his theory about trauma and the brain and addiction is that there's like this imprint that can happen on your brain from the time that you're like literally a newborn and an infant. And he theorizes for himself that the reason that he has struggled with addiction problem, in his case, it's sort of weird, like he was addicted to buying records, like music records, kind of bizarre. But anyways, this is his thing. He's like, he sees this functional pattern of an addict in himself and this sort of trauma and like psychological difficulties. And he attributes that to his mother having been under so much stress when he was an infant, at a time in their lives that was very stressful. And it's not even something he remembers or records. And then I think a lot of his childhood was very normal. So I sort of, I'm not entirely sure that I'm on board with his explanation of trauma like this, but I wonder, what if this is just like you said, with adoption, there are risks. A lot of these kids have so much trauma, they end up having psychological problems. I also wonder if the same would be true of surrogate babies. I don't have proof of it, but I suspect that the same might happen. I just know as a mother, like the hormonal cascade after you give birth and like the connection you feel. I went from being someone who was like, I'm a staunch atheist, I've never felt anything sort of spiritual in my life, to giving birth and being like, oh my God, like am I experiencing like God and spirituality right now? What is going on? Like it's so profound. So I wonder if surrogate babies who are removed from the mother will have long-term impacts from that.
I mean, I think that's a good question. I think the best way to answer that with our current available data is to look at the outcomes of children who are adopted by gay men, because those children have been taken away from their birth mother and given to two dads. And the current evidence suggests that they're doing okay. Could they have been doing better if they had been in an equivalent family of equal material means where there was a mom and a dad? Maybe, we don't know. But we know that if there is a trauma, it may not be as significant as some people imagine it to be. I do want to bring up one point for you to consider that is specific to gay families. And I think part of the reason why homosexual men in particular, are interested in surrogacy as opposed to adoption is that we are terrified of our families being torn apart by people who don't recognize the legitimacy of our familial bonds. And so I know, for example, on my end, if I were to adopt a child, I would be terrified of traveling internationally with that child, because God forbid something happens and I'm in a part of the world where gay marriage and gay parenthood are not recognized. That child could be taken away from me and could then end up in a legal limbo where they no longer have access to their parents who have raised them for their entire life. Our family could be torn apart. And so when I think about surrogacy, I know that even if people around the world, and who knows, maybe in Canada in 30, 40 years, because LGBT acceptance is backsliding, even if they don't accept the legitimacy of homosexuality and homosexual parental bonds, at least I have that genetic backup option to guarantee, at least for one parent, the legitimacy of that family. And that helps just act as a form of insurance for keeping the family intact.
Yeah, it's not insignificant. Of course not. I mean, like, that's a pretty reasonable thing. I mean, like, you could be traveling through, like Southern Europe, right? Like anywhere in the Middle East, places in Southeast Asia, which is not like taboo places to visit. You're not inviting your own disaster by going to like some places. And then they could say anything, especially to your point, Adam, if the child doesn't look like you. You know what I mean? Like you adopt a child who's Asian, and God bless you for doing so. But then you go somewhere, you visit in Cambodia, or you go to Thailand for a yoga retreat or something, I don't know. And then they're like, yeah, keep that kid because it's obviously not theirs. They just stole that kid. So, it does make it complicated. It's a risk that's not meaningless.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
This is challenging. This is tricky work. I mean, one thing that I always say is that if we're going to look at the direction of error, right? If somebody comes to me and they in the emergency department in a family clinic or whatever, and they're like, "Hey, I'm in so much pain and I'm like suffering and so on," and I'm like, you know what? I think that this guy's trying to pull the wool over my eyes, and I denied to give them narcotics, right? On the flip side, if I if the same person comes to me and I opt to give them narcotics and I'm uncertain about how legitimate their symptoms are, the direction of error matters here a lot, because on the one hand, I have denied somebody who was in pain something that was ameliorative, and on the other hand, I gave something to somebody who hoodwinked me. And so the direction of error matters a lot. In this instance, when people would benefit so much from children and society would benefit so much from children, I wonder if I lean more towards the directionality of error, despite the risks that, like Amy has said many, many times, and despite the risks at a societal level, I kind of lean towards the side of siding with the idea of surrogacy. But I think that, to your point, Amy, there should be some pretty strict safeguards about who can and who cannot. Like, getting any kind of surrogacy from outside of your country should be illegal. Like, just flat out, that's it, illegal, because you cannot monitor or defend them. They have no right of recourse. And then to Adam's point, I think that there should be some civil code, maybe not legislative, but there should be some civil code understanding that from a contractual point of view, there are some things that you cannot waive. So a genetic mother who has gone through the process, who at the last moment says, you know what, I need some kind of connection with this child, there should be some contractual ability for them to say, at an absolute minimum, 20% of the time, that child is yours. Some kind of thing to try and mitigate against the potential psychological injury to both the child, the mother, and so on.
I tend to think, and Adam talked about the idea of it in adoption. There are these tricky cases where an adoptive mother wants the baby back. And again, in those circumstances, with the exception of cases where there's a safeguarding issue or the child would be in danger being with the mother, I firmly believe that in all cases, whether it's an adoptive mother or a woman who gave a child up for adoption or a surrogate who gave a child up to surrogate parents, I firmly believe that mother has a right to that child. Except in like these extreme circumstances, like let's say it's a drug addict or someone who would put the child in immediate harm. I think that the legal framework should say that this person is always able to have their child back as soon as they want them, because that is the mother. And I understand, like, I think if that were the legal framework, nobody would even want a surrogate, because they'd be like, at any moment, my child could be ripped away from me. But I do think that that's what is morally right.
I mean, I would agree with you.
Are you saying that, Amy, because there's something unique to the mother or to a biological parent? Because in the case of a separating and divorce, we already see that there can be a complete disparity in terms of custody.
I do think it's stronger with a mother. But I suppose I would feel similarly if a father was doing the same thing. Like if there was a sperm donor and it was the genetic father, I suppose I would probably apply the same argument to the genetic father.
Because in this instance, like for example, if Adam chose to go to surrogacy with some female, and he is a father, he owes some custody rights as well, right?
Yeah,
so
I guess it would be 50-50 in a case like that.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I mean, it would be, with a surrogate, there would be three parents, right? Because you have the gestational parents and then the two genetic parents.
Yes,
right?
You're right. So to Amy's point, we're only saying
sometimes,
relative to the genetic bond, that there has to be some acknowledgement in both directions for the genetic bond. Obviously, the other father would be entitled to something from a marriage point of view. Obviously, so yeah.
Well, I still believe that even with a donor egg, I still think if you grew and catered this life in your body for 9 months, gave birth, I still feel that you're the mother, whether or not you used a donor egg. But I guess in that case, then you've got the birth mother and two genetic parents, and I think they would all have, I guess, a third custody rights.
And Adam has said that too, right? Like Adam has brought that up as the gestational parent, because it doesn't always necessarily mean that it's the a partial genetic parent. So I think Adam has included that framing in his argument.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting here is that we talk so much about the rights of mothers, but we often erase the rights of the genetic mother here. Like, she's sort of treated as a non-entity, and I understand that might just be a symptom of surrogacy being associated with homosexual, like with gay couples. But let's imagine, for example, a woman who's had cancer and can't give birth because of that. And then she, with her husband, use a surrogate or work with a surrogate to have a parent, and then everyone's talking about the rights of the mother, the rights of the mother, the rights of the mother with respect to the surrogate, but like then she just disappears in this conversation, which I think is kind of dehumanizing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
I think you're
I
right.
agree.
Yeah, totally. And that's one of the tricky things. In my mind, to be honest, it's not to the neglect of that person. I always think, even in a homosexual male situation, I always think of the surrogate mother as having provided the egg. But that's obviously not always the case. I don't know what the
Yeah.
rates are of that not being the case, to be honest. I don't know how many women are like, you can use my uterus, but you are opting for a different egg.
And I think a lot of I think it's because the idea of mother is that's such a powerful concept. So you don't really even necessarily think about the egg. But so in the cases where it was a donor sperm and donor egg and a different gestating parent, I still think of the gestating parent as the mother. And then it's almost like you have two additional, it's like egg donor, sperm donor. It sort of relegates them to the status that men usually have in custody situations. But in this case, there's like a woman who gave genetic material for a baby. So, I think I still sort of give supremacy to the idea of like the mother that grew a child with her body. But I think, to be fair, that the legal rights to to the birthing mother and to the genetic parents, sperm and egg, I think they should all have legal rights to that child no matter what. And I think with surrogacy, it just becomes an absolute nightmare. And that usually the ones who are suffering are the women who got involved in this situation and the children.
So maybe Adam, Amy, you guys can each present a 2 minutes final summary, and then we'll obviously invite people to comment and troll in the comments.
Well, I mean, like, I'm going to keep my comment very short, which is that, once again, I just think that regulation is the answer, and I acknowledge and sympathize with most of the points that Amy brought up here, and I understand that there is a significant risk of women being exploited here, and I think that we can all agree that these risks should be minimized as much as possible. Whether that looks like, I believe that requires regulation. You believe that requires prohibition, but I think like we understand like we're broadly aligned on many things here.
Agreed.
Yeah, I don't really know what to say, so I'm just gonna hand it over to Amy. She's more articulate than I am.
Oh, I don't know about that, but I think I think this is such a difficult conversation. It's even more difficult than talking about prostitution in terms of commodification of women, because in prostitution you're just talking about a woman. When you're talking about surrogacy, there's also a child involved, and as you mentioned, Adam, it's like if you ask people whether or not they want to exist or they're glad that they exist, most people are going to say yes, I'm glad that I exist. So it's like you're bringing in this whole other entity and argument, so it's difficult. And it's easy to shift the focus away from the commodification of women's bodies and the abuse of women, because there's this whole other very joyful part in this argument, which is that you have created families, you have given life, you have given joy to so many people. But then at the sort of by the wayside in a lot of these situations are the women that were vulnerable, sometimes abused, sometimes just discarded by the legal system or whatever. And I think my argument is just to never lose focus of the fact that, look at like these women that are being abused by the surrogacy system. These are daughters, it's like they also have the same value as these potential babies. And ultimately, I wish people would see it more in terms of looking at this in terms of buying and selling babies and human trafficking, and don't get drawn into this sort of emotional argument or some of the good that this can bring without really taking a look at and forgetting the harms to women and to our culture in general. So I think that would be my ultimate plea, is like, it's really easy to be swayed by emotional arguments in this, and don't do that. Just think about the net harms. And I think the net harm is a lot greater than the net good for surrogacy.
I encourage everyone to follow Adam. Check him out online. Read his articles in the National Post. If you do not have a subscription to the National Post, you should do that. Adam and Amy are obviously biased. I can say it because I'm not employed by the National Post. But you really should. Arguably the only slightly reasonable mainstream media institution in Canada. I also encourage everybody, as always, like, subscribe, follow, retweet, whatever it is that you do on any of those platforms. But most importantly, comment. We love to hear what the comments are, the perspectives. If you have specific questions for Amy or I or Adam, we can get to him. So I encourage everybody to leave a comment. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
My friends, let us consider that acuity is the refined clarity of thought and perception which enables one to discern subtle truths.